What a tough topic. DED or dead? Well, our job is to convince you that dry eye disease is not dead, and that's going to be what our objective is going forward. My name is Robert Dempsey, and I'm joined with an unbelievable panel here of my co-moderator, Dr. Preeya Gupta, Marc, Gleeson, CEO of Azura, the one and only Dr. Edward Holland, Dr. Marjan, Farid, and Mr. Todd, Brady, CEO of Aldeyra. So we've got a great panel today and a very interesting discussion to convince everyone about the great market of dry eye disease. And we want to walk you through some information and have a viable discussion pertaining to the subject. So let's kick it off and kind of set the stage of how the market is performing. So what we're going to look at here is the U.S. dry eye total RX market performance. So we had a nice discussion this morning led by Kristen, and just want to call out the great work that Kristen and the team do at MarketScope. And I want to thank our friends at IQVIA, along with Bank of America, which provided some of this information. So just to orientate you, we have on the left axis, millions of dollars representing in this market. On the right-hand side, we have the amount of scripts that are written for dry eye prescriptions. And what you see here is a healthy market. The bold graph represents dollars, and the straight line represents the amount of scripts that are written. And I would pose that since 2020, we have seen very healthy growth. And in 2023, report of close to $4 billion in top-line sales through the pharmacies, and approximately 5 million scripts are written. And when you look at the compounded annual growth rate going forward, you're looking at, depending on the source, between 6 to 8% growth in this market. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not a dead market. That's a growing market. Now, you look at the first quarter of this year. Compared to the last quarter of last year, we had double-digit growth, approximately 12%. Our friends at Bausch & Lomb, kudos to them. They brought my baby back. They're going to reinvigorate Xiidra. That's great. They're doing a great launch with MIEBO. And what's very exciting about MIEBO and our friends to B&L, it's differentiated. And that's what's going to be critical as we look at the landscape that Preeya is going to walk us through of the importance of differentiating assets to move them forward. We've also seen another new entrant, Harrow Health, to the dry eye space. Very exciting. We need more players in here investing dollars to get this market to continue the growth that we've seen. Nordic, a new player, a call out to Phil Joya and Dr. J. Again, coming into this space with new energy, new products to drive this market going forward. So I wish I had a audience questionnaire here to say, what's the audience think? Are we comfortable calling this market dead? I would argue absolutely not. So with that, let's take an opportunity to look at the landscape. I'm going to have Dr. Preeya Gupta walk us through the dry eye landscape, both with the approved products as well as the programs in development. Preeya.
Thank you so much. So, I think that it's really encouraging that 3 of the last 5 ophthalmic transactions that were $1 billion or more up front have been in the dry eye disease space. And I would say that, Bob Dempsey was my co-moderator here, who led one of those with Xiidra. But I certainly agree with you that this is DED, it's not dead. And today we have such an amazing panel, and I'm going to pick on Todd and Marc a little bit as we talk a little bit about, there's a lot of people out here that have ideas, that have, products that they want to bring to market, but funding is a fundamental issue as it relates to, developing a program. And so let's talk a little bit about how to get a dry eye disease product funded and to market. And so let's start with you, Marc, if that's okay. So what are the opportunities and challenges when engaging investors and strategics? Really, and I want you to focus on in the current landscape and market, because I think a lot has happened over the last 18 months in our economy, and I think everyone would love to hear. So Marc is with Azura, and they have a asset that is through phase 2 and is starting phase 3, so just by way of perspective.
Thanks, Preeya. It depends on what stage your asset's at, I think. But I think Bob said it at the start. Differentiation, I think, is critical. We have to always consider what the payer landscape looks like, and I think investors, no matter what stage of the development, really look at that end game from a revenue projection point of view. And at the moment, there's not a lot of differentiation, I think, in that payer landscape environment, and that's where I think some of the challenges are. So early stage companies really need to think about the type of patients they're enrolling, the endpoints that they're choosing, and then what do those endpoints relate, or how do those endpoints relate to that particular patient, your mechanism of action, and then ultimately, how does that then relate to your clinical effect size in your registration studies? And I think they're the major challenges.
Great, Todd. So you're with Aldeyra, and your product has gone through submission, so further along. What are your best advice to people when they talk about approaching investors and strategics?
I think, having been an investor for 12 years of my life and run Aldeyra for 12 years of my life and now being only 30 years old, it's kind of interesting to me to see both sides of the fence. Investors want to make money, right? Their thing is the share price has to go up. And from my vantage point, there's two things that drive share price. One is a p-value of less than 0.05 for a clinical trial. And the other thing is a relationship with a larger company, especially if you're a small company. And you're not going to get said relationship unless you have a p-value, but also differentiation. Our claim to fame for Reproxalap is the drug seems to work fast. It seems to have a lot of different kinds of activities aside from anti-inflammatory, and maybe you replace steroids or you could do an office dosing. There are all kinds of differentiating kinds of factors, but I encourage everyone to think carefully about that, especially now that there's so many new products on the market. A lot of investors say to me, oh, there's so many products on the market now. And I play a little game with them. I say, well, how old are you? And usually it's like they're in their 20s. But it doesn't matter what they say. I say, well, you know what? You may have dry eye, or you may get dry eye, and this is going to be a big and growing market. It's not getting smaller, and there's plenty of space for differentiation.
But Todd, dry eye is extremely common, 30 to 40 million plus patients, right? And it isn't overcrowded, right? We have maybe 6 approved topical products, 4 are anti-inflammatories, right? We have 2 non-anti-inflammatories. So, glaucoma is much more crowded in this space than dry eye. And dry eye is a very complex condition that needs different, MOAs that we can get at dry eye. So I think, as Bob was alluding to, I think there's a tremendous unmet need and great opportunity.
Yeah.
Well, so let's dive in a little bit, go down like one more level here. So, in the last 18 months, I think whether it's inflation and different market trends that have put pressure on VC investments, mergers and acquisitions, and what do you think is different today, and maybe even like reflect back over the last 6 months or 12 months, and how is that, as you are, still potentially raising funds, and for people out there that are looking at that, what's changed now? What's different today?
I think Todd's comment earlier, investors, it's a game of mathematics at the end of the day. And the environment for VC investing, and particularly when you look at the end game, which is ultimately market access for patients and therefore revenue, it's very easy for people to do a simple game of mathematics, and the maths for front of the eye doesn't work. But the numbers from the IMS data or IQVIA data show that the market's continuing to grow. It's a huge unmet medical need. There's an opportunity for different mechanisms of action, and I think that's part of the critical opportunity.
Todd, anything else?
I agree with that too. I mean, there's not one anti-inflammatory we use for every autoimmune disease. There's not one anti-neoplastic. There's not one antibiotic. And I think the future is ripe. There are all kinds of different ways we can treat this disease. It's going to get bigger, and the more tools, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
I think also just, from my own reflection. I feel like how you spend your money, it likely is changed in this current environment and what you choose to spend your money on. So Todd, Aldeyra just recently announced that they're going to do more clinical trials to support their FDA application. So walk us through the thought process of, how do you get more funds for that? How do you as a company pivot and decide that that's of value?
Well, I come back to the p-value. That's important. But in our case, one of the differentiating factors for our drug is that we've been able to test it in a chamber. And there are pros and cons to using a chamber, but one pro is that the time frame in a chamber is minutes. It's not days or weeks. And so in theory, you can see activity very quickly if your drug works fast. We announced last week that we're going to start a chamber trial, a couple of chamber trials. I think investors really like that, right? It's short, it's not a ton of money, and investors like both of those things. If you're a private company, I think investors want some sort of return in 2 to 5 years. Typically, if you're a public company, it's like 2 quarters or before market closes. But it's a prime importance to not have to spend $1 billion to get some sort of return or some sort of inflection point for your stock, and at the same time do that relatively rapidly.
Great. Well, I think you heard it here. So p-values matter. I wish we could all pick our p-values. Wouldn't that be wonderful? And differentiation. And I think that's a perfect segue for us to talk a little bit about how the OSD market is changing and transitioning overall. And so, Bob, take it away.
Yeah, I think it's a great transition here. And so now I'd like to get Dr. Holland and Dr. Farid's input on some of the market and how it's transitioning. We've seen, obviously, a new introduction from Bausch & Lomb with MIEBO. We've seen Tarsus really ramping up their promotional efforts, again, more towards ocular surface disease. How do you see these products being used in clinical practice? And Ed, do you want to take that? Okay, Marjan, you want to take that?
Stay on script, Bob.
I think that was a no.
Thanks, Krista.
He doesn't want to
yes, Marjan. Yeah.
So great question, thank you. So one of the things before I even go into all the great products we have available now is, the other reason dry eye disease is not dead, and I think we're just starting to skim the surface, in fact, on diagnosis, identification, and certainly treatment. Only a very small fraction of patients who actually have dry eye disease are being treated with a prescription drop. But the reason I would even maybe say for patients and the impact it has on patients goes beyond even glaucoma and macular degeneration is because it's not just their vision that's affected, and we know dry eye disease affects vision, but there's pain associated with it, right? So there's morbidity that goes along with symptoms that no other disease really has. These patients are the most miserable, and they want more and more. So this market of patients who are demanding to be treated is still untapped, so there's this huge market still. And of course, the mechanisms of action, as has been discussed, is so important because like glaucoma, where you can't necessarily treat it with one type of medication, you may need to layer on 2 or 3 and do a procedure, maybe a MIGS. We need to, as an industry, I think, realize that all of these different mechanisms of action may be required for these patients. You have to find a cocktail that works for your particular subtype of dry eye disease patients. That might include 2 or 3 different drops or topical treatments, as well as a procedural treatment, maybe punctal plugs, maybe a lid margin procedure. But really, we need to realize that dry eye disease is so multifactorial and can be treated and layered on to really, so these treatments now that we have available, is going back to your question now.
Yes, thank you.
So very exciting because we have a few new treatments on the market, and they're all very impactful as they sort of hit the dry eye cycle in different areas, whether it's lid margin disease health with Xdemvy, whether it's evaporative dry eye disease with MIEBO. We have another, cyclosporin that may have some improved sustaining on the eye ocular surface. All of these have been tools to further address these unmet needs in our patients. So it's been great having them, and I think we're, very open as sort of eye care professionals and doctors that treat dry eye disease to having more options for our patients that are better tolerated. Tolerance of treatments is an important factor as well. And, dry eye disease goes beyond just dry eye disease. You have the ocular surface and everything associated with neurosensory abnormalities as well. So I think
We're going to build on that comment in a few
Yeah.
moments. Ed, you look like you're ready to jump through that microphone, so
No,
build
Bob,
upon what...
you told me I couldn't talk, so I'm just trying to obey the moderator. No, one of the problems on this slide, and Marjan was hinting at this, we've kind of lumped everything into dry eye, and that's a problem, right?
Yeah.
Dry eye is very, very complicated. And, MGD and the pathophysiology from MGD is so different from aqueous tear deficiency, right? But we lump it all, and I like the term ocular surface disease because, the opportunity, we can learn from what Dempsey has shown us, right? Yeah. Neurotrophic keratitis is severe dry eye, but they chose a pathway, differentiation or segmentation of the market. They chose neurotrophic keratitis. They've been incredibly successful. And I've seen lots of companies on this list that were in quote-unquote dry eye trials have now pivoted to NK trials because of the success.
So let's build
and
upon
we have
that.
opportunity. You think about the various dry eye states that we lump together. Graft versus host disease, Sjogren's syndrome, Stevens-Johnson syndrome, they're all very, very different. They get lumped into dry eye. And we need to start segmenting out the different causes and stop lumping everything into dry eye.
So let's build upon that. We've seen a transition, and you mentioned, Ed, some of these companies that are listed on this slide. Why are they doing it, and what are you excited about when you look at the slide from that perspective?
Well, I think Dempsey's shown the way. You can get approval to a segment of a condition and be very, very successful, and they've been very, very successful. I've seen companies now going after, say, Sjogren's disease. Now, it's interesting, Sjogren's patients have an inflammatory basis and they don't make enough aqueous tears, but our anti-inflammatories that we have approved don't work on Sjogren's patients. They work on moderate and mild dry eye, except for corticosteroids. So the inflammation that is in those severe disease states is different. And I can see where you get a drug approved for Sjogren's related, and don't call it dry, call it Sjogren's ocular surface disease, graft versus host disease, Stevens-Johnson syndrome.
So, Marjan, looking at this, what excites you about some of these programs that are in development, and in particular, not just the programs, but the diseases that these companies are addressing?
Yeah, I think they're going after areas that we haven't really talked about before. We have, the neurosensory pathways of the ocular surface. We have persistent corneal epithelial defects, ocular surface disease that extends beyond your typical definition of dry eye disease. So very excited because these are really unmet areas right now. Limbal stem cell deficiency, for example, in a very early stage, there's really no good treatments for that at this point. Later stages are surgical, but certainly in the early stages, being able to supply the ocular surface, epithelial health, neurosensory health, these are all untapped areas still.
Priya, it looks like you want to add
No,
something.
I was going to add one small thing, which is, I think it's wonderful to have differentiation, but this is not an uphill, it is an uphill battle in these indications as well. As, someone that's been in some of these clinical trials, we are looking for patients that are not super common. And so there is some challenge in finding these subjects, in recruiting and getting enough of the number of patients needed for these studies to get towards that approval pathway. So I completely agree, differentiation is important, and I'm sure with respect to funding, as our esteemed panel has shared, but there's a downside too.
Got it. Marc, I'd like you to lean in on this question. From a standpoint of, you have clearly a differentiated program, and you're in the process of engaging investors. I know we asked you this earlier, but how's been the reception to investors as you've approached them, and are they asking you these difficult questions?
Yeah, those questions are definitely asked, but I think, coming back to some of the points made earlier, particularly by Ed, around, we talk about market access, and the cynic in me says it's not really, it's an oxymoron. Insurance companies are there to potentially limit market access. Yeah. And so for a clinician whose job it is to find the most appropriate product for that indication and the pathology with which it's presenting itself with, starting off an anti-inflammatory type concept for a glandular blockage seems to be a disconnect. And so the challenge, I think, is identifying the right mechanism of action, the right patient population, and generating data that supports that for the payer at the end of the day. Now, some of the work that we've done, cyclosporin, most companies will end up being lumped into some form of dry eye group from a payer perspective. But I think, there may be the problem associated with prior authorizations to go through a generic cyclosporin, for example, first. But that just doesn't seem to be good medicine at the end of the day. So the challenge is for us to generate the data to convince the payers that the right product is for the right patient. Now, there are some diagnostics now starting to appear on the horizon that really do identify the subtypes of dry eye disease. So that's an opportunity to help payers not necessarily pay for something that's not going to work.
Yeah. I want to go back to the investors and ask Todd to lean in here as well. You've had tremendous success raising capital, talking to investors about your program. What's been successful for you when engaging investors and talking about your program and how it is differentiated?
I think it really depends on the investor. So you got to know your audience, particularly the size of the investment they want to make.
Yes.
I remember one time I had a different company and I had 3 different pitch decks. One for $5 million, one for $20 million, and one for $50 million. And you just got to really tailor your approach, even on the public side, to who you're talking to in terms of the amount of money you want to raise and what they're interested in, the time frames they're interested in, because for them it's about time and money and the amount of money needed for them to make money, and it's all different depending on the investor.
So Todd, for the entrepreneurs out there, biggest point of advice that you have for them as they try to raise capital in a very tough market for dry eye disease?
I took a sales course once.
Oh boy, here we go.
Yeah. How much time do we have left? And it was a 4-step process. It was A, relationship, B, discover, C, advocate, and D, support. So the biggest piece is relationship, building up a relationship, getting in front of these people. I don't love the Zoom thing. And maybe you have to do more of that in Australia, but I like getting in front of people, getting to know them, because that's the key piece. And then you can discover what it is they're interested in, how much money they tend to invest, what kinds of deals they're looking for, what diseases their family members have. And then you can advocate along those lines. And after they make an investment, you get to know them even better, and hopefully they continue to reinvest, which is critical.
So early on, we talked about the key for differentiation. And we know this market, for it to survive and do well, the companies have to clearly differentiate their programs in development. But we also know there's some significant obstacles. And we touched on it with Marc, talking about payers and managed care. And I think it's safe to say there is an elephant in the room. And Dr. Holland, I know you're pretty passionate about communicating this message about the challenges that are out there from a standpoint of gaining access to products. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Marc brought it up, but we don't talk about this enough. One of the single most important aspects of me being a physician trying to treat a patient with ocular surface disease is the payer, right? So I have a patient that comes in with an acute flare of dry eye. There is a corticosteroid I assume is approved for acute flare of dry eye. She is uncomfortable today. She wants treatment today. I have to fail a treatment of topical cyclosporin that could take 2, 3, 4 months to work. It makes no sense. And it's becoming a bigger and bigger problem to the point where I think it could restrict innovation in our field. And I look at Marc's product. Now, we all hope that Marc's product could be the first approved topical therapy for MGD, right? And the threat is that MGD patients will be dumped into the dry eye treatment paradigm and will have to write scripts for anti-inflammatories like topical cyclosporin before I can use a drug that works on the glands. And I don't know how much you're concerned about that, but I think it's a big concern.
We've spent probably 3 or 4 years talking to payers about that issue. Once Restasis went generic, I suppose the payers got their money back on the money that they're outlaying for that area. There is the real threat of actually anybody that has the word dry eye label. As I said, insurers often want to limit access, not necessarily gain access. So there's, it's easier for them just to lump it all and have the individual companies fight it out on rebates and things like that.
But I think what we need to push for is very similar to the glaucoma world, that you can't treat dry eye disease with one drug, with one thing, and each patient is going to be different. I need to do 3 things here, I need to do 4 things here, plus a procedure, and that's what the payers need to be educated on, is that it's, we need multiple treatments for the same patient. It's not fail one, then go to the other, then go to the other.
So to build upon this, Todd and Marc, obviously programs in development, how much work early on did you do at payers to understand the market, to gain their feedback, to work, share with them your target product profile?
Well, I come from a socialised medicine country in Australia, so it's been ingrained in me for 30 years to think about reimbursement. So we've been working with payers for about 5 years or so. And obviously the environment changes, but from a pure commercial perspective, some of the interactions that we've had with payers, they've indicated that yes, you'll probably have to have a prior authorization for cyclosporin, but we'll probably do a 12-month look back. So I look at it and say, well, if there's 3.5 million prescriptions for cyclosporin, topical cyclosporin, hey, if I get 15, 20% of that as it comes through, that's a pretty good opportunity for the first couple of years of launch. So there is that commercial, but that doesn't answer the clinician's request. Yeah. So I think where it comes down to is, what is it that patient that's in Ed's office wants? They want symptomatic relief at the end of the day. They just want their problem fixed. And so if we can demonstrate clear symptom improvement, I think that's, and have the ability to really, let's call it, separate the lines on the graph as much as we can, then I think that will stand.
But is that enough for payers to give you access? And Todd, you're shaking your head, so let's, this is the elephant in the room, so let's make sure we address it.
Our start early is my first piece of advice with payers, because you're going to get asked by investors and big companies too. Our conversations went like this, Ed. Hey, we have a product for dry eye disease. First question, what's dry eye disease? Okay, well, our product, maybe it works really fast and maybe it clears up redness. And oh, we're just going to treat that as a class, dry eye disease. It's all the same to us once we figure out what it is, which is such a shame. It's like antithetical to what you and Marjan have been saying. It's sad.
I think it also changes how clinicians, I believe anyone can treat dry eye disease if they want to, but I think the managed care aspect of it, requiring prior authorizations, and the headache for the average clinician is changing who is seeing the bulk of these patients. And I think that's an interesting shift from a practice perspective that will also impact future, utilization of drugs and who is actually the quote-unquote target audience, for these drugs.
So we need this market to be robust. We need this market to continue to grow. As we close out this panel, I'll turn to you, Ed, for the last comment on advice to the companies out there that are progressing, whether it's dry eye, whether it's corneal disease, whether it's ocular surface disease. What would be your advice to them?
So let's segment the disease state, right? Let's stop lumping, and we do it as clinicians as well as payers, lumping everything into dry eye. Let's talk specifically about MGD. Let's talk about Stevens-Johnson-associated conjunctival inflammation and pemphigoid inflammation, and start segmenting it out and getting specific disease states treated. Dompe has taught us a very, very good lesson, and we should learn from it.
And the sales of Dompe, it's not public, but we're hearing it's north of $500 million, approaching $1 billion. So, kudos to what that team has done. They've educated the marketplace. They've gained access to payers, and they're generating significant dollar value. And when you go back to that last slide, we have seen companies pivot. I think, Ed, you pointed out some of these companies early on were in dry eye. And what did they do?
Most of them are in NK, or even more interesting, now they're segmenting NK to a new diagnosis called persistent corneal epithelial defect. That's a new diagnosis. We didn't have that, you know. So
Is there a
that's
path to
segment
approval
of
with that?
NK.
Is there a path to approval with that?
Yes. There is a pathway, yeah.
It's hard to find the patients, though.
Okay, okay. And last question, can it get reimbursed?
Let's see the data.
What's that?
Let's see the data.
Let's see the data. So with that, I think it's been a very lively discussion. Our goal was to prove that the dry eye market is alive and well. Yes, you have to have a program that's differentiated. Yes, you have to do early work to understand the payer market and ultimately move these programs forward and bring them to the market. But as you saw in that first slide, the compounded annual growth rate, independent of the market source, is looking at between 4, 6 to 8%. So continue to watch the dry eye market, and let's see how this thing evolves and expands. Thank you very much.